Thank you very much for the introduction. As you mentioned, what I'm going to be talking about today is kind of consistent with your exposure to a variety of different concepts, talking about the general problem of catastrophic risk, why it happens, and what we can do in the context in managing that risk. The particular examples I'm going to be talking about, although a lot of the concepts I'm going to be talking about today really can apply to a wide variety of catastrophic risks, whether we're talking about terrorism attacks, natural disasters, and I'd also like to think economic meltdowns. A lot of the examples I'm going to be talking about today come from the domain of hurricanes, mainly because they were down in South Florida, and it would seem appropriate to focus on the kind of disasters that people really worry about here. People do worry about things like disasters like bad tans and sort of things like that, but during in the summer and it gets into the fall, what's the obsession in South Florida? There's probably the area's been hit by a number of hurricanes. It actually, in terms of a metropolitan area, it's the most hurricane-prone area of the country. So what I'd like to be doing today is basically talking about the general problem of catastrophic risk, why we tend to be exposed to it, why it tends to be so bad today, primarily from a psychological perspective. And then as a second part, begin to move into the questions of how do we manage that risk in terms of innovations that are occurring now in terms of catastrophic risk management, particularly focusing on losses of property. Okay, so here's sort of the starting problem, and I think that this is a thing which should resonate with you, that basically if you're at all following the news or anything, you kind of know this, that basically what's happened today is in recent years there's been a radical change in the nature of the set of catastrophes that the world has sort of been dealing with. That in particular, disasters have caused severe insured losses in property. For example, Katrina had $46.3 billion in insured losses. Andrew at $23.2 in 2005 dollars, and so on. And that's not, of course, talking about loss of lives. For example, the most recent earthquake in Haiti and so forth had estimated anywhere between 216 to 250,000 people dying. And so the scale of catastrophes that we're confronting with today is really out of whack with what has been historical experience. In addition to that, victims complain about receiving substantially less than the actual cost of repair. And also, it's a type of cost which is not uniquely borne by the sufferers. Essentially, that it is the case that every time one of these disasters happens, it's the case that eventually the world has to come to bail people out. That in particular, organizations such as the World Bank have to step up. And in the United States, disaster relief suddenly becomes a major portion of spending of public money. So it's a thing that even for individuals who are not living in disaster-prone areas, it's a problem that everyone has to specifically deal with. To try to give you a feel for kind of what the timeline of this is like, if you kind of remember back in the 70s and 80s, it was the case that, well, disasters have always been around. They've always been things that we've needed to worry about. But basically, if you look at kind of this is catastrophic insured losses between 70 and 1986, essentially it was kind of cruising along at a fairly flat level, and it was not the type of event that made many radar screens. Then starting in 1987 or 88, suddenly there began to be a big uptick. We started to have events like the earthquake in San Francisco area in 1989. We began to have Hurricane Andrew in 92, the La Paloma earthquake in 1995. And then, of course, what happens most recently, the numbers seem to be skyrocketing. And what's particularly frightening is with each particular year, we can run this out to 2009 was a little bit of a low year, but 2010 is already off to a horrific start. And a lot of the preseason forecasts for the hurricane season indicate that this will be a very active hurricane season, quite possibly similar to what we saw in 2005. And if that's the case, well, you're going to see another one of these very huge spikes. And if you're in the business of a property owner, if you're in the business of an insurance company, this is stuff which makes you worry. So, for example, to kind of reiterate this, if you look at kind of the 25 most costly catastrophic insurance losses between 1970 and 2008, it turns out that 12 of them has been since 2001. So this is a large problem, and it's also increasing in its magnitude. Okay, why? The hint of it has really nothing to do with global warming, okay, if that's sort of the instinct or the thing you often hear about it. But basically, the explanation for it is pretty simple. And we have this paradox that on the one hand, if you look at kind of what we know about natural disasters, our ability to predict hurricanes, our understanding of earthquakes and why earthquakes cause damage and what you can do to mitigate it, all of that science has progressed dramatically since, say, the turn of the century. But what's happened is that while that knowledge and our scientific knowledge of these disaster events has increased, that you have kind of counteracting that the fact that even larger increases in human and capital exposure to hazards has occurred, and disproportionately small increases in investments in mitigation. So essentially what we have is just not to the fact that natural disasters are becoming more common, but rather value at risk is increasing exponentially. And that is a primary source of concern. And we're not doing as much as we could do, what we should be doing to counteract this increased risk. So it becomes a great thing to be able to build on coastal property, while at the same time we're not fully absorbing the cost of building on coastal property in terms of the risks that exposes. Okay, so what I'm going to be doing today is basically is a presentation that's going to focus on two things. Okay, one of which is the question of how do we get ourselves in this dilemma, or why is it that we don't, as a society and as individuals, invest as much as we should in mitigation, or basically taking preventive steps to make sure that when these very low probability, high consequence events occur, that in fact their effects are fairly minimal. And secondly, talk about possible policy remedies in terms of innovations that are occurring in the area of insurance. And in particular, one of the messages I'm going to have at the end is that most traditional risk management instruments, particularly in the way insurance contracts traditionally are designed, effectively are not really workable as a long-term workable solution for this type of catastrophic risk. It's not that the instruments themselves are theoretically poorly designed. It's just that when you kind of match them up with political constraints and behavioral biases, essentially they tend not to work. And we'll talk a little bit about possible remedies for that. Okay, the first question, and this is sort of what I'll spend a good bit of time talking about, is why we underprepare. And the argument is that essentially the reason why we underprepare is effectively it's the way we're wired. That in particular, as decision makers, we're not really well engineered to make optimal decisions how to protect against low probability, high consequence events. That in particular, if you think about the way in which we tend to be wired, we have a tendency to have fairly short memories of painful things in the past. We have a tendency to not have very good foresight in terms of anticipating possible pain that might come in the future. And then when we're put in a situation of trying to figure out how do we manage this or should we take protective actions, we go ahead and we look at our neighbors. We ask other people, what are they doing? And of course, they're subject to the same biases. So essentially, we all jump off the cliff together. And you'll see a lot of examples of this as we go through. Okay, and the other thing which exacerbates this is the fact that it's not like there represents in any given situation an optimal course of action, a specific thing that if we all did it, this will solve the problem. The problem is that while we might be aware of aggregate risk, it often becomes very difficult to know how that specifically translates to personal consequences. People might be aware of the fact that, let's say, real estate prices are overinflated. People might realize that they live in a hurricane-prone area. You might know that you live in Southern California and you're prone to earthquakes. But in some sense, people have a difficult time taking that abstract notion of the risks that they're facing and translating it to what is that specifically going to mean to me in terms of the amount of personal harm I might experience. And then secondly, there is inherent uncertainty about the cost effectiveness of mitigation instruments which compete with other things. And a lot of that is related to the timing, which we'll get to in a minute, that there's an awful lot of things that you can do to make your house more hurricane-proof. Or if you live in California, there's an awful lot of things that you can do to make it stronger against earthquakes. The question is, which from that pool of things is the most cost-effective strategy for a particular homeowner? And also, when is the exact time to do it? I'll give you a lot of examples from laboratory simulations we do for earthquakes that often what people have a tendency to do is they solve the investment problem as if their planning horizon is basically very, very short. So if you're a homeowner and you just moved in and you're looking at your TV and it's an old projection TV and you're kind of embarrassed to have your friends come over and look at it, and you go to Best Buy and you can get for a fairly small price, a big, 57-inch plasma TV, and then you could either spend your money on that or buying earthquake insurance, okay, or basically reinforcing your foundation. Well, I think with the way a lot of people solve it, it's not like they say that buying earthquake insurance or building a stronger house is a bad thing to do, but rather it's a type of thing that's an easily deferrable expense. You would ask yourself, what are the odds that over the course of the next week I'm going to get an earthquake? And odds are astronomically small that you will. So therefore, it's a thing you can kind of get the immediate pleasure up front and postpone the less pleasurable investment until a little bit later. And then finally, there are scarce opportunities for learning. The reality is that the positive benefits of mitigation are rarely seen. We'll see a lot of examples of this in a bit, where often what happens is that let's say if you're the person who's the prudent homeowner out in California, and you and your neighbor both had the opportunity, you could either buy earthquake insurance or a plasma TV. Well, which one tends to get more positive reinforcement? Well, the person who gets the plasma TV, because the mitigation is the benefits of it are only realized conditional upon the event occurring, and the odds of that happening tend to be pretty small. So in some sense, the benefit of it is defined on a long-term expectation, not what you're going to realize in the course of a single day. So most of the time, investments in protection tend to be negatively reinforced. Okay, so what I'd like to do is kind of walk through examples of 3 central biases that I would argue that form the psychological basis of why people tend not to invest in mitigation, or let's put it this way, underinvest in mitigation. The first one is unwarranted optimism in what I call the bane of temporal remoteness. If it didn't happen to us personally, or it happened a long time ago, we don't have to worry about it. So let me kind of give you an example of one of my favorites. I don't know if those of you who are familiar with the Mississippi Gulf Coast, or has anyone ever been to this particular location, Pass Christian, Mississippi? No one? No one? Okay, good. Well, Pass Christian is a very pretty town right on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi. And you sit on the beach there, and you can go look out at this big expanse of the Gulf, and it's not heavily populated, and so therefore there's a lot of elbow room in that particular town. And it's the only thing that's a downside of it, it tends to be prone to occasional hits by hurricanes. And the nature of the Gulf there, it tends to be very, very shallow. So when hurricanes come, they're enormous storm tides, okay, which basically goes for several miles inland. So other than that, it tends to be a pretty nice place to live. And to kind of give you a feel for the type of risk that you face when you live in Pass Christian, this represents, the vertical lines represent the incidence of a major hurricane hit along the Mississippi Gulf Coast between 1700 and 2008. And basically, the return period for a major hurricane hit, that's one's associated with a big storm surge that will do damage, is about once every 40 years. And it turns out that once every 40 years is a bad periodicity, okay, because it's basically just short enough that basically it can kind of cause lots of damage and people will still have some memory of it, but not long enough so that it will keep the event fresh in people's minds. So to kind of give you an example of a timeline, I'm going to focus on one particular piece of property in the city of Pass Christian. It was the intersection of 2 roads that sits right on the beach. And this is sort of the story that goes with it. Back in 1947, there was a big hurricane came up, and it actually it scraped the coast, basically hitting in just west of Pass Christian and just north of New Orleans. It was a mini Katrina. Okay, it basically flooded lots of New Orleans, and it took out most of the existing structures along the Mississippi Gulf Coast. So as a consequence, there was an awful lot of empty land which is in the area that's now Pass Christian. And so there was one particularly attractive piece of property that people saw and saw this as an opportunity to build a really, really nice apartment complex. And they were called the Reclio Apartments, and they were cement block construction, basically 3 stories. I don't know if you can see it. Don't have a thing, but basically in the middle there, if you can make it out, there was a really nice swimming pool. And the nice thing about it is that almost everyone, given that the Gulf of Mexico is in the forefront, basically almost everybody had a water view. So it was a really, really nice apartment complex. Well, anyway, in 1969, Hurricane Camille, which was a Category 5 hurricane, hit past Christiane. And so an awful lot of people went and sought refuge in this very, very secure building. And then in the morning after Hurricane Camille, it was taken down to its foundation. Okay? And it was like 20-something people died who tried to survive the storm and that. So after Hurricane Camille, this piece of property was sort of a landmark point of a disaster, so no one developed it for a while. But if you're a real estate developer, there's just nothing more enticing than an empty piece of property at a low price. So anyway, but the thing was is that what don't you want to build there? Okay, everybody remembers the apartment disaster, so you don't want to put another apartment complex up there. So what they did was it was purchased in 1995. They put up a shopping center. It was a Winn-Dixie Rite Aid shopping center, and it did well. Unfortunately, then all of a sudden Hurricane Katrina comes along, and this is that same lot again after Hurricane Katrina, and it was once again taken down to its foundation. So I was just really curious about this, and so I went ahead and I called the developer of this property, and I said, or the owner of it, I said, what are you going to do with this? You know, no one's going to touch this piece of property now. And he said, well, you're right. We're going to have a new strategy for development. And so I said, well, what do you mean by that? And he goes, because the new codes that are coming in require that everything has to be elevated. And the bad news for that is we can't put a shopping center if it requires elevation. So what are you going to do? And he says, well, we're going to put condos up. Okay, and so, and this actually is for sale now, and this is a condo development that's basically one piece of property I think it's further west along the coast. And so essentially we kind of get this endless cycle of going in circles. And then his view is, well, if it comes once every 40 years, that's what we have to sort of deal with. Now, the second thing is this idea of procrastination. That even if you're in a situation of knowing you need to invest, there is this tendency to go ahead and say, well, we recognize it and we plan to make the investment, but given limited resources, it's an investment that we can always keep postponing as long as there continues not to be a disaster. My favorite example in this one is the case of New Orleans and the false alarm of Hurricane Ivan. Hurricane Ivan occurred in 2004, and it was an interesting sort of precursor to Katrina. It existed it was coming out of I don't know if you can see this. This is Florida on the right, and there's Cuba and so forth. It was a Category 5 hurricane, similar in strength to Katrina. It was coming out, and all the computer models had it hitting New Orleans. So as a consequence, the news articles that came out on this storm were humongous. That basically said, you know, direct hit by Ivan in New Orleans could mean a modern Atlantis and so forth. So the Mayor Nagin looked at this and said, we got to get people out. Okay, this is going to be a very, very serious event. The whole city's going to be underwater. So he ordered a general evacuation of the city. People began to try to leave, but he discovers that, well, evacuating the city of New Orleans is going to be pretty hard. And in particular, he said that, you know, he would aggressively recommend people to evacuate, but it would be difficult because at least 100,000 of the city rely on public transport and have no way to leave. Then they said, well, what do we do with them? Why don't we put them in the Superdome? And so then the problem was that the Superdome might be used, but a spokesman for the stadium said earlier that it was not equipped to serve as a shelter. Okay, so the question is, so then what happened after this is good news, is that Ivan spared New Orleans, went off to the east, and they got a little bit of rain, but that was about it. So the question is, here's a little quiz. What should the city have learned from this close call? Okay, and there's three possible answers here. A, be thankful that the city averted a catastrophe and take immediate steps to remedy the evacuation problems. B, appoint a commission to study the evacuation problem and fund it on next year's budget. Or do nothing, realizing the city was safe for another 40 years. Well, in some sense, the answer was not A. Okay, what they actually did, it was somewhere a blend between B and C. And of course, 1 year later, you had exactly the thing that they feared happened from Ivan happen. And in some sense, given the opportunity, this perfect foresight of what would happen, just simply we did nothing to kind of really remedy it. Now, kind of a related thing is the question of, well, how short are disaster memories? And this is the thing, a lot of the work that I do kind of does a blend between laboratory experimentation and field research using secondary data. And we had kind of an interesting picture of an answer to this question as follows, is that there's growing evidence that actually memories for disasters actually tend to be pretty short. And by this I say memory for the disaster, it's not that people literally forget the disaster, but their memory of the impact and its ability to influence their decisions tends to be fairly short. Or in some cases, it's the first intervening non-event. The one way, kind of an unusual way of getting some insights into this is we got access to a rather remarkable data set. And there was a company called compete.com. And what they do is they gather complete web surfing habits of people throughout the United States, and they have an ongoing panel. The way it works is that essentially, in fact, actually they have millions of people that are actually on their panel, and they have just warehouses effectively of computers that store all their web surfing habits. So you might ask the question, well, how did they get that many people to let them kind of keep all their web surfing habits? Well, it turns out that, like, for example, if you've ever signed up, or one of your kids or whatnot has ever signed up for like a Hotmail account or something like that, you get this thing that says, like, I accept all the terms and conditions. Okay, how many people actually read all of that fine print? Okay, probably not. Well, it turns out that for a couple of these websites, one of the terms and conditions is that I hereby agree to surrender all my web surfing data to compete.com. And what they do with it is they don't use it for malicious purposes. They keep it in-house, and they use it effectively to test the effectiveness of different types of promotional mechanisms to see if somebody's running a pop-up ad versus a non-pop-up ad, how does that affect visitation and so forth. So it's not that they use it for malicious purposes. But in this case, we contacted them, and they gave us an interesting opportunity to study how people surf the web in advance of hurricanes. So we had data from 141,000 web users from 5 southeastern states, and we recorded that every URL visited with an exact date and timestamp from August 15th to 31st. That was from before the storm even formed out in the Atlantic to provide a baseline all the way through when it dissipated inland. And we could look at a bazillion different things here, but we decided just for the hell of it to start off by focusing on the degree to which they visited weather sites, which would be the sites that would be given the most complete information about the storm's threat to their particular area. Now, to give you kind of a feel for what this looked like, I'll show you this little animation. And what this is each of these circles here represent areas in which we had web users. And a white circle basically means they weren't visiting weather sites. And the darker the circle, going from green all the way up to dark blue, meant they were intensively using the web to search for weather sites. One thing you might want to notice, for example, is that Florida tends to be weather focused. Okay, and they're always going to weather sites because they tend to worry a little bit more about storms and so forth. So what I'm going to do is basically click this, and you're going to see what happens to the pattern of websites as the storm approaches and then moves through. Of course, you saw on August 30th what happened was in the Mississippi area it all goes white, and that's because all the electricity people have evacuated and so forth. So therefore, that's why they're not surfing the web. Well, anyway, so what we're interested in is just trying to find out what are the correlates or what are the things that predict when a person is being actively searching the web. So this turns out to be kind of a tricky thing to do because there's so much data and there's so much noise in it. So, for example, this is by state. This is over time. This represents daily patterns of visitation of websites. And you see, for example, there's a lot of diurnal variation. That reflects the fact that I think that the peak visitation. Does anybody know when peak web visitation is during the day? Late at night. Okay, it's about like 10, 11 p.m. at night. And so anyway, so those represent the peaks. And then what we have is the vertical lines over here. These each represent the different points of landfall. So the first dotted line is when it makes landfall in South Florida. The second one is when it makes landfall in Louisiana. And you see it's a complete mess. And so what we were looking at ways of doing is to try to give a smooth picture of this to try to see if there were any systematic patterns by area. So we used a kind of a method which is called, some of you who are kind of more statistically oriented would be familiar with, called functional data analysis. And what this allows us to do is essentially we fit Fourier series to these noisy patterns. So it allows us to give a smooth look at the degree to which you see different peaks of utilization by area. And if you break it down by area, we kind of came up with sort of an interesting result. Okay, the first thing is if you look, some of this sort of makes obvious sense as to when it was that people were visiting these weather sites. If you look at the blue dot, which the blue dashed line, that represents southeast Florida. And it makes sense that essentially there's a low level of visitation, and then that's the first point of landfall of Katrina, and it peaks just at the time the storm is coming in. It made landfall around 7 p.m. during rush hour, hard hit by the storm. And where you see the peak, that was about the time when people were ordering evacuation and warning that this would be the end of the world. And you see the rapid drop-off prior to landfall, mainly because people are heeding the evacuation orders. But what was interesting to us was actually not either one of those. Oh, and I should add, by the way, that let's see, the green one with all the little stars, that represents inland Alabama, Mississippi. And they don't really care about the storm until it's really close to them. So that's all kind of obvious stuff. What was actually interesting to us is if you can see it, the orange dotted line, okay, which seems to have to closely follow the southeast Florida visitation rates, and then peaks up similar to the people on the Alabama Gulf Coast, and that's Florida Panhandle. But what was interesting here is why is it that people in the Florida Panhandle seem to care about the Katrina when it was hitting South Florida way more than people just a few miles to the west in the central Gulf Coast? And so we had a couple of hypotheses, one of which is that, well, maybe because they're Floridians, they had a certain, they felt a certain compassion for people in South Florida. But if you spend any time in Florida, you know that people in the Panhandle would just be just as happy if they kind of lobbed off South Florida and set it in the place. So that probably was not likely. The other one, which was our main hypothesis, was that it was actually Hurricane Ivan, the storm we talked about just before. It turned out that Hurricane Ivan hit the border between Florida Panhandle and Alabama just the season before. And in fact, most of the damage was in the Florida Panhandle. So we figured, well, what it is that those are people who, that was the last storm of the previous year, and that was what was making people pretty sensitive to this. So what we decided to do was basically break down the data a little bit more closely by looking at very, very specific counties, and these represent the counties which received a direct impact from Ivan the year before. And we noticed that actually that big peak, that big increase in visitation early was actually not for all the counties that were affected by Ivan, but only one county, and it was a county called Santa Rosa County in the Panhandle, which is actually not the one which is most severely affected by Ivan. And it turned out that there was a fairly simple explanation for why it was that people in Santa Rosa County were so worried about Katrina. And that was the fact that just 1 month before, they had a hurricane, okay, which was Hurricane Dennis, which is a very, very small, tightly packed hurricane that effectively only caused significant damage in one county, and that was Santa Rosa. So the lesson of this was it seemed to be the case that if the storm was a month earlier and you experienced a lot of pain, then in fact it really caused people to be on high levels of alertness and going to visit the web. Whereas if that same level of pain or even greater pain had occurred the previous hurricane season, then it was essentially as if you hadn't been affected at all in terms of visitation rates. So it really did seem to be the case that people had these very, very relatively short memories for how past experiences with storms impact your desire to take action. Now, kind of related to that is this idea of people's memories in terms of how it can have the opposite effect, is the contrast between what happened in Houston's evacuation from Hurricane Rita in 2005 and Ike in 2008. Some of you who kind of follow these things might remember Hurricane Rita, and Hurricane Rita was sort of more known for what it didn't do than what it did do. It came right on the heels of Katrina. In fact, it was about less than a month after Katrina. It was stronger than Katrina in the Gulf of Mexico, and it looked to be headed towards Houston. So as a consequence, people in Houston, they ordered 1 million people to evacuate. Problem was 2.5 million chose to do so, okay? And the reason is that if you had been following the news on Katrina, you know you want to get out of Dodge because you didn't want to be one of these people that was underwater, and it was just horrific pictures from the New Orleans area. And it's really, and so as a consequence, the Houston was just simply not prepared for this sort of an event. And it ended up that it was taking people like 13 hours to go 4 miles, and there were actually more deaths from the evacuation than there were from the storm itself. So what did people kind of learn from that? Well, then 3 years later, we have Ike, and this time, this is not a false alarm. Okay, Ike is coming through the Gulf of Mexico. At this time, all the models have it headed straight for Houston, and actually at an angle of hitting the city, which would be the worst possible angle in terms of storm surge. And the National Hurricane Center noticed, hearing from local officials, that people weren't leaving. People were leaving, but it was not nearly at the level which they thought was appropriate for an impending disaster. So what they did was that Bill Reed, who actually was from Texas and from that area, he was the director of the National Hurricane Center, put in the advisories to say that if you're in certain counties along the coast, you will face certain death. Okay, so you have the option of dying or leaving. And so what happened was, so how did Texans respond? Well, that basically, it turns out that they had about 140,000 people were in the certain death zone, and while 70% left, 30% didn't leave. Okay, so there were basically 40,000 people left to contend with the worst of the storm surge. Now, fortunately, as it turned out, the storm was not quite as bad as it could have been, although it was the case about 100-some-odd people died, and it was basically a major relief effort to helicopter and get people out and so forth. But in evidence, it was a thing where they clearly weren't absorbing particularly that lesson. Now, I want to say one other thing is the fact that the problem with pressing too hard on this forgetting story, that people just have short memories and so forth, is just there are a lot of counterexamples which seem to say that that doesn't quite ring true because people have very acute memories of disasters. And so it's clear that it's not like they're forgetting the disaster itself. So, for example, what happens in a lot of communities to remind people of hurricane threats is they put up monuments. So, for example, the one in the upper left is what's on the seawall in Galveston to remind people of the 8,000 people that died in 1900 from a hurricane there. The one in the middle is if you ever take a drive down through the Florida Keys, on Isla Morada, there's a monument for the 1935 hurricane, which killed 450 people, and so on. The one in the upper right is for Katrina, and the other two are from up in New England, reminding people of big hurricanes. So it is the case that people have no shortage of reminders of these past events. So what sort of explains then this disconnect with people have acute memories of these events in the past? You know, if you wanted to put in the domain of the economy, it's not like people never heard of the Depression or anything like that, but nevertheless there's this gap between the objective memories of things that have happened and then your ability to take actions to prevent it going forward. And it turns out that it seems to be the case that the way you reconcile this discrepancy is what erodes is not perceptions of likelihood or not perceptions of or memories of the event or personal beliefs that this is going to happen, but rather perceptions of the personal vulnerability of it, that basically you forget the pain that's associated with this thing. But for example, one thing that we do is we do studies in which we look at, ask people before hurricanes come, what's the likelihood that it's going to hit your town? And what happens is people give an exaggerated estimate of what that likelihood is. Or if you do a survey of people in South Florida and you ask them, in a given year, what's the probability that you're going to be hit by a hurricane? And it's way in excess of what the actuarial odds tend to be. But nevertheless, what happens is then if you ask them, you know, what are you doing to protect it, or how much, if a hurricane happens, how much do you think you're personally going to suffer from that, that's where you see the disconnect. This colleague of mine, Jay Baker, who's at Florida State, he's like in the geography department there, did a series of interesting longitudinal studies of risk perceptions in eastern North Carolina. And he just did a simple survey, and we asked people at 3 different year points, How safe would you feel to be, how safe would your home be in a 125-mile-an-hour wind event? And then he asked people living on the beach, mainland surge area, non-surge areas. And it turned out that the last big hurricane to hit hit North Carolina coast was in 1996. And so what's happened basically in every year since then, there's been no real changes. The houses haven't been made any stronger or anything like that. But what's happened is people are just feeling safer and safer and safer. If you ask them what are the odds that you're going to get hit by a storm, that hasn't changing. But what is changing is people's beliefs that they're actually going to suffer or they're going to suffer personal losses from that. So this represents a real challenge if you're kind of in the business of trying to sell mitigation when in fact if convincing people that the event is going to happen is not going to do it. They have to personally feel at risk or at danger. And kind of along with that is this thing called the paradox of safety. And this is, a number of people have studied this. And this is sort of this idea that the better science becomes at predicting hazards and the better technologies become at protecting against them, the more likely we are to put ourselves in harm's way. And the argument sort of goes like this. If you look at the way in which psychology of losses work for big events, if we have any particular, let's say for this or for hazards, basically you have long tails, okay, where eventually there's an awful lot of disasters or most events cause small amounts of damage. Most tornadoes don't cause a lot of damage, but what you hear about and the ones that you worry about are the long tails, the ones out in the extreme. Now, the thing about it is, if you think about what is it psychologically, what's the psychological impact of these types of events, it's not the little ones that we worry about or people that really that strike a chord with people, but it's those extreme ones. So if you think of this as on the right axis as being the psychological magnitude of the loss, it's the things at the extreme tail that really get people going. So here's sort of the paradox is that the more that we kind of invest in making things a little bit safer, so the more that we effectively prune off the extreme low tail so that if you're living in your house, odds are it's not going to completely blow away, but only might have some roof damage and so forth, what happens is effectively you're curbing the distribution so it moves this way. The problem is it's that extreme tail risk which is the one that gets people to move. So the consequence is that the less fearful the distribution becomes, the less of an impetus people will have to go on ahead and make investments in mitigation. So paradoxically, you could have this thing where by having limited amounts of mitigation and make things moderately safer, you actually have an increase in the overall set of losses. For example, if you look kind of geographically at an interesting lesson of this is where people have historically located cities around the world. And it turns out that the most hurricane-prone place in the world, anyone want to take a guess? I'm sure no one's going to know. But anyone want to take a guess? Hurricane or typhoon-prone place in the world. It's the Philippines, northern Luzon. Okay, and effectively every given year, there's always big hurricanes, in this case typhoons, that come across. And the thing about it is, what's interesting, the reason why I mentioned that is if you look at kind of the distribution of where cities are located in Luzon, it's basically away from the dangerous areas. They're effectively inland. And if you look at the way things are constructed, essentially what they put on the beaches in Luzon are just tear-down shacks, whereas if you go inland a little bit, essentially there are fortresses. So essentially you have this thing where just over time they've adapted pretty well to the risks that they're facing. And the reason why they've adapted so well to it is the fact they've been there for a really long time at a time when they viewed typhoons as being something that would actually kill you and something which you couldn't easily recover from. So it just made common sense to them that you don't build in harm's way. Then in contrast, you look at South Florida, which is the most hurricane-prone place in the United States. And where do we see all the building going up? It's as close as you possibly can get to the ocean. Okay? And so as a consequence is that we feel that hurricanes in the United States are things which are survivable, whereas they're not survivable in other places. And to kind of to feed into that, is this idea that where learning does work is in cases where people have had intensely extreme experiences with respect to disasters. I remember when I was at Wharton, I started doing a lot of this work and learning and showing how people didn't learn. And I came down to Miami and I began sort of talking about this stuff to people around here. And then I quickly learned that someone would raise their hand and said, yeah, but you weren't here during Hurricane Andrew. Okay, and there is a Hurricane Andrew effect of people that were in South Dade County during that storm, and they do not mess around with storms. They basically, their houses tend to be, if they can afford it, tend to be, they have all the hurricane impact glass, and they're very, very vigilant about investing. And likewise, if you look at other things, like, you know, if you're old enough to have parents who lived through the Depression, that had a transformative effect on the way in which they thought about investments going forward. And likewise, people who were directly affected by the World Trade Center attacks, it's fundamentally different to have that kind of an extreme experience from people who only have sort of moderate ones which are easy to forget. Kind of an extreme example of this is of kind of the power of extreme fear. Does anybody know what these things are? These are, I'll give you a hint, these were very popular back in the late 1800s. There's a big market for these things. You can actually still buy them on eBay. Any takers? It's to protect against something. What is that? What? Vampires, yes. They're vampire protection kits. And so there used to be actually a market for vampire protection kits. And what's interesting about this is that this is a thing where, first of all, as far as we know, they're 100% effective. Okay, no one has ever been attacked by a vampire that had one of these things. But you know, so why is it that, for example, you could get people to buy vampire protection kits, yet you can't get people to buy storm shutters? Okay, well, the thing is that vampires represent this big, unknowable, deep, profound fear that basically causes, if anything, people to overreact in terms of protection. Whereas storm shutters, you know, it's difficult to imagine, to be really fearful of winds blowing in your house, and so that represents a difference. Okay, then finally, the third bias I'd like to focus on is this idea of imitation. That there's sort of this another paradox, if you will, is that we feel the risks facing our neighbors do not apply to us, but the decisions made by our neighbors do apply to us. So we think that the neighbor is the one that's going to get the house brought down if a hurricane comes through. But then what happens when we're trying to decide whether to get storm shutters, when to put storm shutters up, who to go for insurance, we ask people next door, what are you doing? And unfortunately, this has a tendency to basically cause collective effects in terms of mitigation, which rather than having intelligence come from the masses, where we put together people in a group, they become more intelligent. In some way, they become somewhat less intelligent. And let me give you an example of this in the context of earthquakes. One of the things that I do experimentally or empirically is I try to study a lot of this stuff in realistic laboratory context. The idea is that by definition, low probability, high consequence events don't happen very often, and therefore it's difficult to study them in the field. So what we like to do is to set up simulations. So we programmed this earthquake simulation, and it worked something like this. It was a real-time game where they played for real money. And very briefly, the way it worked is that you were located, you start off the simulation and you played as part of a community. So it would be yourself and maybe 6 or 7 other people would be living with you in this community. And then the screen in the upper right shows this map of this hypothetical country, and it shows you where your house is. And you play this game for about maybe 15 minutes, 15, 20 minutes. And at any point during the simulation, it's all run in continuous time, an earthquake could happen. We don't know how big it's going to be, where it's going to happen, but you're told roughly during the course of the next 15 minutes, there'll probably be 3 or 4 earthquakes. But that's all you know. There'll be 3 or 4. And now what you can do is that you're given a budget at the beginning, and you're given a house that has a certain value. And then you can make a decision whether to spend that money making your house stronger, or else you can go and invest it in a bank for a certain return rate. And often we had like 10%. And so at any point during the course of this, you could make the decision to take your money and build a stronger house. Now, the interesting thing about this was that is that during the course of this, you also got to watch what other people who were living in your community were doing. So if you look at the panel on the left, those represent pictures of the different houses of your neighbors, and it gives you all sorts of details as to how much they've been spending so far. And the stronger their house becomes, the more colorful it is. So it's just like living in a world where you get to see your neighbor has a better roof than you do, or they're making these sorts of investments. So what we're interested in is that simply putting people in an environment where they get to observe what their neighbors are doing, does that lead to greater or lower safety? Well, the first thing we found out was that we play this multiple times, and we put them in a world where, in most cases, where it's optimal to build an extremely safe house, given the frequency of earthquakes. And we wanted to know if people could figure that out, and they never do. What happens is that they have a tendency to basically invest if, let's say, imagine you could go all the way up to 100% in terms of investment, they tend to go to about 35%. So everybody spends something, but not everybody goes all the way as far as they should. So what we were interested in was kind of running an experiment in which what happens if you provide intelligence in the community. That is, you secretly tell one of the people that is playing this game exactly what the right answer is, and to see if you can get one person to kind of lead the group to making building safer houses. So this is essentially sort of what happens. What we do is we let them play 3 rounds of this game. And this is a situation where we also considered cases where it was not optimal to invest in mitigation, where the optimal policy was to spend nothing. That is, in this case, all mitigation was doing these investments was a placebo. And so what we did was we let them just play the game without any information, without giving any intelligence into the community, just so they can kind of get a feel for how this works. And as you see here, well, in this particular case, it's about 50%. If 100 is the most you can invest, 50% is about what they did. Now, the optimal was 0. So here's a situation where it's a placebo, but they were overspending in mitigation. So what happened was that after one game, we went up to one person in the community, and people didn't know who the person was, but they did know that there was one smart person in the community, and we gave them a piece of paper, and it said, in this particular case, what it said, the optimal investment amount is 0. Okay? And then we let them play it for 15 minutes. We reshuffled. We let them play it yet a 3rd time, and this is what you get. And as you see, it's sort of converging. It's moving towards the efficient equilibrium here, which effectively we didn't invest 0. People were still wanted to invest a little bit. Just somehow it felt psychologically good to do something. But effectively, it was kind of clearly moving down towards 0, which it should. But here's sort of the more interesting one. This is the case when it was optimal to invest 100, where the optimal thing to do was to invest all that you could in building an extremely safe house. So what happened is that once again, people are spending a little bit under 50. All of a sudden, we inform one person of the right thing to do, which is the right thing is as soon as possible at the beginning of the game, build the strongest house possible. And this is what we get. Okay, then it goes back down to 0. And so we would look at this and we just run this over and over again, and we can't understand why people aren't investing. Because we told, when we looked at it, we'd go over to the one person and we said, what are you doing? Okay, because you're, why isn't it that you're making these decisions? And it turns out that we have this thing where even though you give people, in hindsight, it's kind of obvious. In the same way that you can go to a teenager and you can tell them, it's optimal not to smoke. Okay, the reality is they're probably going to smoke anyway. Okay, even if they have a mind to do that. So in some sense, because what's overriding this is sort of personal biases and so forth, which are very, very difficult to override by simply telling people what's the right thing to do. So in particular, what tended to be happening here is that that the people who were informed of what the right action was were basically postponing the decision to invest. Because remember, they had the option to put the money in the bank and earn interest or spend it on mitigation. So essentially what they were doing was they were letting the first few minutes go by and thinking, do you think I can survive the first 2 or 3 minutes of this game without an earthquake? I'm willing to take that bet. And so what happens is the people who even knew that they had to build a safer house, they figured they would do it, but they would do it ideally just before the earthquake hits, okay, which they have no idea when that's going to happen. But so what happens is then other people in the community are looking around to see if there's anybody that's spending a lot on mitigation to suggest that they might be in a risky world. And of course, they don't see anybody doing that. So therefore, they then conclude that they must be in a low-risk area. So then they stop investing. And then oddly, the person who initially knows the right thing to do sees that no one else is investing, and they feel kind of a sense of reassurance by the fact that everybody else is at risk. So essentially, and it's just, we've yet to find a way to kind of undo this to get people to, unless you put sizable financial incentives in place to get them to behave optimally. Okay, so how are we doing on time here?
So we have about a couple minutes, and then we can move to questions.
Okay, okay. So what I'd like to do is spend kind of the last time talking a little bit about kind of the policy, or what do you do about it, consequences of this. And the thing that we do at our risk centers, we focus a lot on half of it on kind of why do we have these problems from the psychology perspective, but the other half of it is also what do we do from a risk management perspective. And the problem that we're currently facing, that the state of Florida and a lot of risk-prone areas is that the insurance model, which was traditionally set up to manage these sorts of risks, is essentially broken. And for pretty obvious reasons, that one of which is that losses are rare and highly correlated, which implies there's significant timing risk. You don't know when that big loss is going to happen, so therefore if you're an insurer, you have to have reinsurance, which is costly because the loss distribution is ambiguous, and investors and reinsurers are averse to ambiguity. There's a big premium for that, which leads to market premiums that are more than many people can afford or feel is fair to pay. And so state regulators cap premiums, which causes insurers not to provide coverage. And so this is in some sense a vicious cycle which the state of Florida is currently wrestling with, and represents a general problem in all disaster-prone areas in coastal areas throughout the United States. So what is it? How do you fix the problem? Well, two things. Obviously, one thing you can do is that the problem essentially goes away if you can prune off that tail risk. The way you do that is through mitigation. That in particular, if all structures in Florida were built to 2008 code, losses would be reduced by 60% in a 1 in 100-year event. So if you could simply get people to build and retrofit houses so that they're safer, that goes a long way. In fact, that's most of the way to solving the problem. The problem is, we talked about earlier, it's very, very difficult to get people to make those investments. Or alternatively, and parallel to that, is more efficient risk diversification mechanisms. The other problem is right now it's very, very difficult if you have very, very highly correlated losses and you're an insurer in Florida to find a way to diversify away that risk. And so there have been numerous proposals for how to achieving these have been aired, but few have been implemented, somewhat due to the psychological factors and political barriers. Sort of to give you kind of a real 2-minute snapshot of this is, if you think about what are the different diversification options for this type of catastrophic risk, well, you can diversify in general markets. So, for example, one of the nature of cat bonds is that it goes to let's say, retirement fund managers who are basically looking for an instrument of investment whose risk is uncorrelated with the general market, and the presumption would be that catastrophes is one of those. Another one would be space, that you basically look for geographic pools. Get somehow Florida to pool together with California to have a common pool, and with the idea that earthquakes and hurricanes are hopefully uncorrelated. Long-term contracts, and then new products. So what I'm going to do is just, well, quickly on geographic diversification. Some of you may be aware of this. There's sitting before Congress, there's this proposed Homeowners Defense Act, which would create a multi-state reinsurance pool with the U.S. government being a guaranteed to back up any large losses. The problem is, I think that the likelihood that this is going to be supported, at least this particular point in time after the big bailout from last year and the health insurance thing, is pretty limited. There's an awful lot of mainland, interior U.S. aversion to going ahead and using taxpayer money to help out people in Florida. Even as deserving as we are. And likewise, it doesn't really solve the mitigation problem, because it basically comes down ultimately at the end of the day to trying to have to build safer structures. The other one, which I'll kind of end on this. This is a proposal that at the Risk Center, and in particular Howard Kunrather, who's my co-director, has been advocating. It's this idea of long-term insurance contracts. As you know, how long is most of you have how long does insurance last? How long is your contract? It's 1 year, okay? And so the idea is to say that well, one way we can diversify, if we can't diversify over space, diversify over time, that effectively get people locked into very, very long contracts, and then associated with that is that then you go ahead and have long-term loans for mitigation, so that you don't have to pay the amount for mitigation up front, but basically becomes a reduction in the premium spent over a long period of time. Needless to say, kind of insurance companies are really very resistant to buying into this notion of long-term contracts. I think for many reasons, it's just such an alien concept, they haven't done it. Like for example, in the 1930s, how long do you think residential mortgages were? Anybody know? If you were in the 1930s, you wanted to buy a house and you went to a bank, what was like the longest? It was like 3. Okay. So basically, the notion of a long-term residential mortgage is a relatively new concept. And so this is sort of one of our arguments, is that that to some degree, that if we're looking for ways of diversification, it may well be that at this point in time, the one proposal which seems to kind of get it both ways, provides an incentive for people to mitigate, that overcomes the objection that people have, spending a lot of money to fix a house when the returns from that might be only in the very, very distant future, is so that they can kind of see a year-by-year reduction in the premium that they're facing for insurance. And insurers, in theory, should be more willing to do that if they can, in fact, diversify the risk over a long period of time to allow them to overcome the risk timing problem. So I'll go ahead and I'll end on that. And just kind of a concluding thing is that I do think that what kind of brings me into this area and why it's a problem that we all need to worry about is the fact that this problem of catastrophic risk is a huge one, and it's likely to only get bigger as the years go by. And it's a thing which, unfortunately, we know far less about, both from a behavioral perspective and a normative or solutions perspective, than we really should. And even though there are a lot of proposals on the tables for dealing with it, right now they're having a tough time getting traction, mainly because there's an awful lot of political barriers to getting these things. And unfortunately, the risk management field, i.e. insurance, tends to be perhaps like banking, tends to be a pretty staid field where the idea of doing things radically different tends tends to meet with a lot of resistance. Okay, so thank you very much.
We have time for at least 1 or 2 questions. Yes, if you can use the microphone.
I was wondering whether you sort of give it some thought or have some perspective on, I mean, one other take on it is sort of the classic econ take on this, is that there's obviously some moral hazard problems also. I mean, people sort of locate in these areas in part because they know they're going to get helped and they're going to get bailed out. And so it seems that, I mean, you've sort of given us now sort of a more behavioral sort of biases in people's behavior. But if as a first order concern, would you say, it's these biases that we have to work on first, or is it that you'd say it's as large as the moral hazard problem that you have in these things, or do you have a sense?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Two things there. First of all, the moral hazard one is it's maybe the most common point which is sort of raised on this, is the fact that why do I need to build a safer house? Why do I need to invest in anything? The government's going to come in and bail me out. Well, to the degree which, surprisingly, there's not a lot of empirical evidence which shows that that's what motivates people not to invest, that they're thinking the government's going to come in, mainly because it's uncertain, okay, that what you have to do is the worst situation you could be in is to have a moderately bad disaster, okay, where it hits your house and you're uniquely affected. What you want is, if it's a disaster is going to happen, you need a Katrina type event where the government will come in wholesale. So there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence that necessarily protects it. But nevertheless, certainly when it comes to like risk pooling, that's an argument which is very forcefully argued, that effectively it creates this moral hazard. The counter argument there is to say the reality is that one way or another, well, first of all, that insurance rates and so forth should reflect the actual amount of risk that you're facing, but it's going to be difficult to that moral hazard thing is difficult to avoid, because we tend to be pretty compassionate, such that if people choose to move on the coast, and we can look to them and say, why are you doing that? Okay, you're moving in harm's way. Nevertheless, when their house gets wiped out and there they are in the news with their kids sitting with no place to live, we tend to come in and bail them out. And so just by warning them ahead of time, the only way that you're going to remove that is to basically say, no, if you choose to move there, you're not going to be bailed out. Okay? And the reality is I think that we will, unfortunately, in most situations.
May I ask you a follow-up question, sir?
Yeah.
This is a follow-up to Professor Blix's question. Would you apply your decision analysis, please, to the insurance arrangements for health insurance in Massachusetts as they exist now, where there's a large panel of decisions by both insurance firms, insured and uninsured? And would
Okay.
Utilize that service?
Well, do you have an answer? Okay, so I'm not 100% sure I fully follow that. Okay, I'm not that familiar with Massachusetts.
That we tend to underestimate the things that will happen to us.
Yeah.
We underinvest in mitigation strategies.
Yeah.
And we'd all like to get insurance as the hurricane hits.
Yeah.
Would you apply that reasoning and that framework, sir, to the insurance situation in Massachusetts?
Okay. Well, I don't know that much about Massachusetts situation specific. Yeah, I think that. Right.
Health reform.
Right. I think that absolutely everything I've been talking about here has a direct parallel in the case of health insurance. That you have exactly the same thing, where effectively people have a tendency to not want to invest in protective action. That all the way from for doctors, for example, one of the real problems in getting people to stay on therapies is that once the symptoms go away, effectively people have a tendency to only want to invest in protection or invest in preventive actions when in fact they're feeling some pain. So essentially they'll go to the doctor after it's there. And I think one of the real big challenges in this area is how do you get people to essentially lower the real cost of insurance by getting people to invest more in prevention and so forth. And that's a major challenge. Now, I'm not 100% sure as to how in Massachusetts, how they're handling it, whether they have particular insights into that, which is different from other places.
Well, you can't hear me very well, sir, but you can take a look at the planned expenditures versus the actual expenditures and the behaviors of healthy persons who do not have an illness, who take out insurance for 3 or 4 months while they have an illness and then drop coverage. I'm not telling you anything that's not in the newspaper.
Yeah.
But I would like to hear your analysis applied to that fact pattern.
Okay. Aside from the fact that from their perspective it seems like a rational thing to do, that you want someone else to pay for it if you're sick, yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that, and this is really, this is somebody who's more an expert in the healthcare debate and whatnot really should be addressing this. But I think that part of it is that you could look at the structure of having the on-again, off-again nature of insurance, where you have it for a little period of time, then you don't have it, then you can have it again, and so forth. It basically blends itself to that kind of, what you might argue, sort of socially dysfunctional behavior. That a better model would be one where effectively everyone is contributing to the pool over a long period of time. And that's, for example, ironically, one of the arguments in favor of the National Defense Act is rather than having states suddenly take an interest in federal government, federal money when there's a big disaster, what you do is you make them have a long-term commitment, which they're locked into over a very, very long period of time, which eliminates what essentially is a moral hazard problem from a state perspective.
Okay, we'll stop there. Like I said, we're going to have a break now, primarily just to get the computer set up. So if you do